name's Rob Forsyth. I'm a Senior Fellow in the Culture Program. Our question tonight is, where is Australia headed? And we have two speakers from opposite points of view. Tom Switzer, our Managing Director, is well known. Previous experience in academic journalism, and still today has a commentary on Radio National. Nicholas Moore, our Chairman, previously Chief Executive of the Macquarie Group, and many other esteemed positions and achievements. So we've brought the best today. Tom will be arguing the depressed view of the world, and Nicholas, the optimistic view of the world. Each will give a presentation, maybe even covering similar material with different conclusions. Then I'll moderate a brief discussion between them, and then the best part of the evening will be over to your questions. So with no further ado, Tom, tell us the truth.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, and it's great to be here this evening. When I was born in the early 1970s, so 50 years ago, the overwhelming conventional wisdom was one of doom and gloom. You may have heard of this quote: "The battle to feed all humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death. If I were a gambler, I would take even money that England will not even exist in the year 2000. Paul Ehrlich, Population Explosion. Get a load of this one. This is the Harvard biologist George Wald. Civilization will end within 15 or 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. And so on. This was the overwhelming conventional wisdom among the so-called experts. But needless to say, none of this came to pass because of human ingenuity, global capitalism, digital technology, technological progress, all that saved the day. And if anything, population estimates declined. Biotechnology advances found ways to slash global poverty. And the Cold War, as far as the US and the Soviet Union were concerned in the epicenter of Europe, turned out to be the long peace, as the historian John Lewis Gaddis put it. For the past 30 years, which is to say all my adult life since the end of the Cold War, the world has witnessed unprecedented peace and prosperity. Steven Pinker from Harvard, Johan Norberg from Sweden, Matt Ridley from Britain, Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore, and Tom Palmer from America. Most of these gentlemen have been guests at CIS, and they provide all the available data to show that by any objective criteria, living standards did improve. You think about poverty, sanitation, malnutrition, literacy, security, child labour, infant mortality, personal freedom. Life had improved dramatically for many people around the world. In 1900, the average life expectancy globally was 30 years of age. Today, it's 70. So huge improvements in living standards. So I'm naturally an optimist. Now, there was the September 11 terror attacks, and of course that spawned the war on terror. And we're all too often told that in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, that the downfall of Saddam Hussein would lead to the creation of a viable, liberal, democratic Iraqi state. But of course, as my friend Daniel Hannan has pointed out, we spent $1 trillion, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, turned millions more into refugees, only to end up destroying Western prestige and creating more extremists in the region than ever. Now, that's all true, but remember, this is a fact. In the 1980s, more people died in conflicts across the Persian Gulf. And of course, no world war has been fought in more than 75 years. 4 decades ago, when I was at junior school in the early 1980s, Australia was economically insular, weighed down by protectionism, industrial unrest, and economic interventionism, and chronic inflation. By bracing free market reforms, which groups like CIS supported at the time, Labor Prime Ministers, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, backed by Coalition Prime Minister John Howard and, in my judgment, our greatest treasurer, Peter Costello. They put in place free market reforms, and as a result, it changed the way this nation did business. From the interventionist mindset that delivered turmoil in the 1970s, the poor white trash, as Singapore's founding father Lee Kuan Yew once dubbed us in the early 1980s, we were transformed from a heavily protected closed shop into the envy of the industrialised world. And we experienced a very long burn, we all know about this, 29 years of uninterrupted economic growth with, according to the Productivity Commission, no great widening in inequality. So I come here as an optimist instinctively. However, I am now becoming increasingly depressed about the state of the world and Australia's place in it. And I say this for four main reasons. The first, obviously, is the COVID pandemic, a once-in-a-century global pandemic. The virus, it's well known, it's killed more than 5 million people. The lockdowns, the restrictions, the border closures, that's all created anxiety and even depression among so many usually free people. And it's not just health and mental, it's the economic costs in fighting the virus. Think of the colossal rise in borrowing, the additional money pumped into debt-ridden economies to fight the virus. Think of the COVID-inspired supply-side chain crisis. All of this will lead to rising inflation, and we're seeing this right now in the United States. The inflation figure today in the United States is the highest it's been since the early 1980s. A hidden tax, as the great Milton Friedman called it. Now, we're all too often told that the debt costs very little when interest rates are near zero. That's pretty much true. However, when interest rates rise, as they will in coming months and years, and they already are in New Zealand and Britain, and they will, the Federal Reserve will raise rates possibly as high as 50 basis points next month, the RBA won't be far behind. The burden of interest costs on the debt rises too, which means that government's costs of servicing the debt from past spending will limit future spending. Now, that may be a good thing in that it imposes a sense of fiscal discipline, but are publics in the Western world ready for this? Remember, the great Milton Friedman, past guest at CIS, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Yet the electorates who yearn for the magic money tree seem oblivious that the costs will continue to be paid by their grandchildren. But it's not only the wealthy who end up footing the tax bill, it will be everyone. Second crisis, what's called cancel culture. Now, this has been the inflammation of what the distinguished British historian Simon Heffer have called the phenomenon by which anyone in public life, the media or academy, runs afoul of the extreme leftist orthodoxies of a militant and vocal minority. Now, admittedly, this trend is more evident in the United States and Great Britain than it is here in Australasia. But nevertheless, the prosecution of identity politics is happening, and it seeks to divide people by race and religion and gender groups, and that will just further divide society. Now, of course, no rational person can dispute the destructive effects of prejudice on individuals and society. All nations around the world have episodes in their past that today we rightly condemn. But the activists in charge of cancel culture all too often look for racism and sexism when often there is none. If the cancellers strangle debate, they will suppress ideas and seek to standardise opinion. And future generations will come to regard free speech as dispensable and Western liberal values as inherently bad. And as a result of this toxic political polarisation, it'll make it very difficult for both sides of politics to come together and put in place sound public policy. The third challenge is climate mitigation. Western leaders, and I say Western because this is not really the case for the developing world, but Western leaders are hell-bent on reaching net zero emissions within the next 3 decades. This is a radical shift from what has been cheap and reliable gas, coal and oil to what will be, without taxpayer subsidies, unreliable wind and solar. The world today depends on fossil fuels for about 80% of our energy, 80% of our energy. And this is a key point. In the next decade, government budgets promoting the energy transition will be constrained by the heavy burden accumulated in the wake of the COVID pandemic. The process of decarbonising the economy is not a cost-free exercise, especially when the developing world, and I made this point recently in the Wall Street Journal, they need fossil fuels to grow their economies and reduce poverty. By weakening the economies of the West, net zero is a boost to an expansionist China, which will not just chug along the smoky path to prosperity, but we can safely assume it won't power its aircraft carriers with winds and solar. The cold hard reality is that wind and solar sources, unless there's a massive technological breakthrough, just aren't up to powering the world's economies. And despite the world leaders at all the various climate change summits, despite the fact that they pay lip service to scaling back the use of fossil fuels, oil and gas prices are soaring due to increased demand, while coal use is reaching record highs worldwide. Now, yes, fossil fuels damaging to the planet, but the retreat from nuclear was short-sighted, particularly in countries like Germany that lacked viable alternatives. The fourth and final challenge is China. This is the strategic and economic competition between not just China, but the United States. That is likely to be the defining feature of international relations for the foreseeable future. And it's going to take place mainly in our neighbourhood. The COVID crisis has coincided with not just the ruthless centralisation of Xi Jinping's power, but it's also coincided with the expansion of the communist giant's global footprint. Now, Canberra, and I think this is fair to say, it's broadly a bipartisan issue, has rightly pushed back against this. They've stressed the importance not only of pushing back against wolf warrior diplomacy, where Beijing uses its economic heft to harm or coerce weaker, smaller states that pursue policies not to the Chinese Communist government's liking. But Canberra is also right to deepen ties with other regional states such as India and Japan and even Vietnam, an old Cold War foe, because these countries, like Australia, are genuinely worried about the aggressive intent of China's rise. Now, this is a shock for Australians because we lived in the unipolar moment for the last 30 years. In fact, since the end of the Vietnam War in the mid-1970s, our region has been peaceful, mainly because our closest ally dominated the region. And we just came to think that these good times would last forever. It was just hard to imagine great power rivalry ever returning to our region. But that world has gone away, not just because of the end of the unipolar moment, but because of the rise of China, which in hindsight, many countries, including our own, helped fuel. All this comes as the United States, our most important security partner since 1942, is increasingly focused on, frankly, peripheral issues like Ukraine and Iran. Meanwhile, Washington is frighteningly polarised and deeply divided. Public confidence in virtually every major US institution, from the courts and the religion to the media to the military-industrial intelligence complex, they have collapsed. The standard of political leadership, from Trump to Biden to Kamala Harris, is a shocking sign of America's political and intellectual bankruptcy. And I say this as someone who's been a great admirer of the United States. So the message tonight, in conclusion, is not that we are doomed. Somehow, we, as we always have, will soldier on and adapt to the coming challenges and problems. My point, though, is that for the reasons I've set out, the 4 Cs, COVID, cancel culture, climate mitigation, and China, one must recognise that we face very dark times indeed. And with that, I'd like to put forward the counter-argument by my friend, chairman and boss, Nicholas Moore.
Well, thanks, Tom. That was very persuasive indeed. I think I should sit down now and probably go home and have a quiet beer. But my role actually is the opposite, and I have always been an optimist, and I will continue that this evening. So my presentation is headed "The best is yet to come." Now, people who have seen me present before, you would have heard this before. And the truth is that, like most good things in the world, I actually picked it up from somebody else. When I took over Macquarie in 2008, took over when I became chief executive, you probably remember it was a pretty grim old time, and so optimism was in short supply. And I used to stand up and make optimistic speeches sort of like what Tom did, the good bit rather than the bad bit. And someone sent me a presentation that was actually done by his grandfather a few years before, not a few years, back in 1982. And this was a guy called Stan Owens, who was the first chairman of Hill Samuel that became Macquarie Group. And the title of his speech back then was "The Best Is Yet to Come." And this was in 1982. And so, as Tom mentioned, 1982 was pretty grim. People were pretty pessimistic about the future. Unemployment was 9%. They had real interest rates back then, double-digit interest rates. You know, there was oil crisis. The world was very, very grim indeed. And he stood up in front of a group of wise business people, probably men back then, and said actually the best was yet to come. And that was a great theme I decided to latch on back in 2008. And it's you know, basically it's worked since 2008. But I'll also start with a question from another Tom, Thomas Babington Macaulay, who said, on what principle is it that when we see nothing but improvement behind us, as Tom has shown us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? Now this was in 1830. So Tom is not actually new to this theme, yeah? In 1830, people were onto this question where everyone was a bit depressed. And things were basically, as time goes, you know, relatively early on in terms of this story of optimism we're talking about, 1830, right? So when we think about the Industrial Revolution, everything changed about 250 years ago. This is basically, you know, all the way back to, you know, the Ice Age. And this shows per capita income. Basically nothing happened. There was a bit of good news along the way about here. That's the Black Death, right? The Black Death, extremely good news for per capita income. We lost a third of the population, and so everybody's income went up for 200 years. So it was like a happy day. But of course, that then passed away. Now, everything then changed back before the previous mentioned Tom worked. Now, why had it been like that? And it's basically another Tom, this guy Malthus. So Malthus basically had the view, which is very persuasive, that if we have productivity improvements, we just have more kids, and so basically we're always starving. And that was actually not just a theory, it was the reality for a long time. But as you can see, the way per capita income changed, it was a dramatic difference 250 years ago. Everything really changed. So Tom rattled off a number of statistics. I'll go through them. But the point of it is, it was massive change. Like, the world has changed. And the question is, are the 4 C's that Tom spoke about sufficient to knock over that incredible momentum we saw back then? And my argument is, of course, no. You know, we'll talk about each one of the 4, but plainly it's not sufficient. Now, as Tom said, life expectancy increased dramatically from 30 years to 70 around the world. Child mortality, you know, reduced obviously dramatically. Literacy increased, hourly output increased, crop yields. This is an interesting chart. The amount of land being cultivated actually has fallen, whereas productivity, of course, has increased dramatically. We're feeding a lot more people, and it's a long-term story, and not a story that I would argue is about to stop. We're working less, we're eating better, and diseases of all sorts are receding across the world. But as Tom mentioned, Steven Pinker also made the great point that not only are we richer, living longer, materially better off, but actually morally we seem to be better. Who would have thought that people morally over the years seem to be changing their judgments about what's acceptable or not? So things like murders, and Pinker, if you've read, most of you guys would have read the book, of course, he counts the bodies. He always says it's always the good place to go to work out how people are going. You count the bodies, and we're just killing people less. Human rights. Slavery obviously ended over this period. Torture has been abolished. And of course, a whole bunch of rights movements, really important in terms of African Americans, Indigenous people in our country, disability and sexual rights, have actually become part of what we expect in terms of our daily lives. And of course, democracy has increased dramatically in terms of the number of countries. And of course, the number of wars, as Tom mentioned, you can't quite see this, sadly it's all washed out, but the number of wars have fallen dramatically. And so albeit we still are killing people in wars, which is regrettable, compared with the good old days, the number of people we're killing is far less. Across all societies, the US executions are down, China executions are down, US, as I mentioned, executions down as well. And as well as that, of course, it's not just a Western phenomenon. Even more importantly, this is a global phenomenon. The number of people living in absolute poverty has fallen dramatically. Back in 1990, 37%. Today, a bit over 9%. So a huge change in terms of not just what's happening in the West, but globally. This is a really powerful shift that's taken place in the world. And as you see, there are 137,000 people a day moving out of absolute poverty. And this is a slide I used to love as a CEO always to put up, because every year every read, particularly people in financial markets, they're reading about all the bad things that are happening out there. And we read the newspapers and we're seeing all the terrible things. And if you see at the end of the year, what's GDP done in terms of the year before? Basically, not much. There's a few bad events out there, obviously, like the GFC, and obviously COVID is a bad event, but mostly the world just keeps on growing at this 3.5% rate. It's a very powerful locomotive we've got behind us, very powerful locomotive that continues to push us forward today. So is my argument. What's been the driver of this revolution? Well, obviously at CIS we've got a view. Lots of people have views on this. And again, in terms of the contest of ideas that we're all about here, we've seen a lot of people present on these over the years, but they sort of come down to some things we're familiar with. Free markets, obviously very important. Freedom to contract, scientific revolution, liberal democracy, bourgeois values, and global trade. Now, the point about all these is they're very messy. There's nothing here that's sort of clear cut and it's going to end up with an absolutely correct answer. They're all sort of like approximate answers, but it's all part of this trial and error process of humanity where we try one thing, it doesn't work, we try something else, it does work, we pick up what we've learned and we take it forward. So it's sort of like intelligent evolution, as it were, where trial and error, we are continuously working with and continuously contesting ideas and contesting business models across the whole spectrum. And it seems to be working. Now, my argument is the sorts of points that Tom has raised, all four of them, frankly, come back to this idea of the contest of ideas. And it's our role at the CIS actually to contest those ideas, to talk about whether they're good ideas or bad ideas. And that's the good part of our society. It's the good part of what we in the CIS do, and frankly, the great and entertaining part of life. Now, in terms of the debates we have, it's always important, obviously, to think about this guy who you can't see his name. That's actually David Hume. And David Hume made the very important point that as humans, we're driven by our passions and we use our brains to support our passions. Right? So all of us. And we all come to here tonight with a whole bunch of beliefs and what have you, and we'll use our brains to justify our arguments one way or the other. It's a great insight, really important, but it's really important in terms of this idea of contestability. Unless someone, if you have an idea, which is probably prejudice, and someone challenges that idea, that's when you actually try to find the reality. So someone debating with you the point, if you have a business leader and the business is trying to develop a point, it's the competitor comes in and actually says, well, you think you've got a good product? I've got a better product. Similarly, in the political sphere, someone's got a good idea, they put it in place, how does it work out? We have an election in 3 years' time to determine it. So that contest is really the key part of who we are, and we can't forget about it. Now, Steven Pinker we talked about before. One of the joys I had as the CEO was actually having conferences I could organise. So you don't have to get a lot of authority as a CEO. One of the things you do, and you can invite people. So I invited this guy, Steven Pinker, to come and said, look, I've got this problem. I've got this guy called Tom Switzer. Why is he so pessimistic? And he came out to Australia to tell us why Tom is pessimistic. And he said there's 4 emotional bases for pessimism. Number 1 is the illusion of the good old days. Now, when you heard Tom talking about US presidents of the past, the good old days, and how good they were compared with the current politicians, like really, Tom, like you really think those guys were good? We can talk about that in a second. But, JFK, the guy you love, almost blew the world up. Like we wouldn't be here. I mean, these guys were dangerous people, and compared with who we are today, perhaps they weren't so good after all. The second thing, of course, is emotionally bad is always stronger than good. Third, very important, is the competition for moral authority. It's always, we were talking before about prophets. Right, Rob? And Rob will tell you about prophets. Prophets never stand up and say, you're doing the right thing, guys, off you go, right? If you're a prophet, if you've got moral authority, you're saying, guys, you've got to change what you're doing, it's all wrong. That's where your moral authority comes from. And the fourth problem, which I think is the one that we all suffer for, is this availability bias. So as we know, from the point of view of things that interest us as people, we can't blame the press. This is what we all do. If it bleeds, it leads. Like we want to read about gossip. We want to read about people being counselled. We want to read about disasters. We want to read about bad things happening. So we fill our mind up with this stuff. And because of that, we actually think it's true. Right? Now, we've filled our mind up with the 4 points Tom talks about, but it's a bias, right? It's a bias in terms of who we are, and we really need to take a step back and objectively look at all these issues. So This is Tom being pessimistic, and he's 4 reasons he's talked about before. COVID-19, of course, cancel culture, carbon, and of course, China at the end of it. So let's go through his 4 reasons for being pessimistic. Number 1, COVID, right? Now, COVID obviously is bad, but we're talking about Australia and COVID, and instinctively all of us looked at the restrictions on COVID and thought this can't be a good thing. But when we look now at the facts, hopefully it's after the event, hopefully it's passing through. It's not yet, I take the point, we're not through it yet. But what was the impact on COVID on Australia? Well, obviously the government threw the chequebook at it, and we saw debt to GDP go from 20% to 40% of GDP. 20 to 40%, that's a lot of money that got spent, but it did have a good outcome. Number 1, obviously the people who died in Australia were way less. This is per million. So way less people died in Australia than in the United States. By the way, they spent twice as much as we did on COVID. Twice as much. We had far fewer people die from it. And then from an economic viewpoint, it's a no-brainer. In terms of the outcome here, this is Australia. In terms of what happened to employment, we're back over where we were before COVID. America is still struggling to get there. So if you look at Australia versus America, obviously we went well. One of the great things, though, in terms of the contest of ideas, we will have the time in the years to come to look at all the different things people did for COVID around the world and find out what the right outcome was and what it wasn't. But in terms of these initial numbers, you wouldn't say that Australia is in a bad place. In terms of debt to GDP, obviously debt to GDP is bad. Annualised cost, 0.7%. 0.7% of GDP, it's not nothing, but it's something actually we can afford. As a nation, we could afford to actually do this. This is an important thing. People have choices. As a nation, we have choices and we could afford it. What's 40% of GDP mean? This is the UK going all the way back to 1727, and this is 40% of debt to GDP. This is the actual UK debt. So during those happy times we saw where England grew and led the world in terms of growth and all the rest, their debt to GDP was far, far higher than the debt to GDP that we have here. So I'm not worried. Now, cancel culture. This is something I don't know all that much about, right? I'm not a big, cancel culture guy. I looked it up on Google and tried to say, okay, who's been cancelled? Okay, here are 3 people who have been cancelled. What are the consequences for them? Well, J.K. Rowling, according to the financial report for her publisher, revenues went up 27%. So that wasn't so bad. Kim Kardashian, she's got a new program apparently. We're all going to subscribe to it, apparently on better terms and conditions than the last one. And this guy here you recognise, he is 3-to-1 favourite to be the next president of the United States. So cancel culture is bad. In terms of Australia cancel culture, well, you probably look at these people and you probably don't know who they are. I don't know who a lot of them are, but is it really the biggest issue we have in our country today? I guess is the question I'd ask. Carbon. Okay, carbon's a big deal, obviously, but again, with all these questions, it's important to put it in context. How big is the grid on the East Coast? It's about 600 megawatts. Replacement cost, if we're going to scrap it all tomorrow, it'd be $1,000 to $2,000 to scrap it. Our GDP, as you know, is about $2 trillion a year. Putting it in context, so the government spends about $500 billion a year, and we've got a transition period about 25 years. Now, is renewables a good or bad cost of power? The answer is it's quite complex. Lazard, an investment bank, puts out a report on a regular basis. It's got a high degree of credibility in terms of the cost of power renewables. This is Australia here and here. This is wind and this is solar. This bit here is the cost of gas versus solar, and you can see solar's way cheaper. Our guys tell me it's somewhere between $30 and $70. Here is wind versus combined cycle. Again, renewable is cheaper. Now, quite rightly, you would say, well, it might be cheaper, but you need backup power if you're having renewables because it doesn't run forever. You need backup power. So how much will that cost? If you're going to back up the whole system, say 50 megawatts, it would cost you about $50 billion. That's to back it all up. Now, $50 billion is a lot of money, but if you double it, because everything costs more than you think, that's about $4 billion a year on a GDP of $2 trillion a year. All right? Now, in terms of one of the things that the CIS is very focused on is of course, housing affordability. Annual cost of housing in Australia is $230 billion a year. And in terms of Peter Tulip's research, he thinks our housing is probably overvalued on average by about 20% as a result of planning restrictions around our country. So the cost of that regulation, that regulation, we're fighting against it, but putting it in context, is about $60 billion a year. So can we afford to have the planning that we have today? Yes, we can. We can afford to spend $500 billion by the government. We can afford all this because we are a wealthy country. We can have the planning approvals. We can also replace our grid if we decide. Now, finally, of course, is Xi. What's on Xi's mind? I mean, like all of us, I've got no idea. I ran an organisation of 14,000 people, and I can tell you every day there was a lot of worries on my mind. So running a country of 1.4 billion people, there's a lot on his mind, right? There's a lot of worries he has on his mind. I'm sure Australia figures very, very small in terms of his list of worries. If I was you, which I'm not, what would I be worried about? I would be worried about this. This is the working age population in China, and you can see it's peaking right about now, and it's not going to get any bigger. It's falling. And this is a document from Lancet, and this is showing the overall population by China is expected to hit about 700 million people by the end of the century. So he has a major problem on his hand in terms of actual numbers, and this is a chart in terms of what drives these numbers. And this I've put China, Japan, and Korea here. Now the bit in the middle, this is the population bit in the middle. This is so people from 40 to 50. This is maximum expenditure. So these are people who really drive the economy. People are buying cars and having holidays and building houses and all the rest. Now you can see in all of these three different countries, these people are moving off to the happy hunting ground. They're going to stop spending before too long. In China, they look like they've got a fatter tail down here in terms of the young people reading Google, which is probably a bad thing to do, but basically a lot of people are very sceptical in terms of that population structure, and they suspect that China's population may be less than 1.4, and actually, more importantly, in this piece here, this key piece in terms of the future of China could well be thinner than it looks on that graph. So as I said, I don't know what Xi is worried by, but if I was Xi, this is like the key issue I'd be concerned about. Just coming back to that Lancet article, which had the details, one of the interesting things, people who are positive about Australia and agree with Stan, this is where Lancet has Australia today, number 12 in the world, and if you believe them, which I don't, by the way, in 2100, we will be the 8th largest country in the world in terms of GDP. So at least independent verification in terms of the best is yet to come. So this is what Stan said at the end. With commitment, involvement and enterprise, we can be certain the best is yet to come. I agree with that. I'll just put in the point that we're all about here at the CIS with contest and competition. We need, as a country, to be contesting all these ideas, actually having competition from a business viewpoint, from a government viewpoint, and most importantly, from an ideas viewpoint. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Well, that was not as depressing, but certainly as entertaining as I was hoping. Before I ask you for your questions, I have one question to each of them. Tom, you feeling any better?
Well, I mean, as I said at the first third of my remarks, Nicholas and I are at one. I've written many articles in, of all places, the Sydney Morning Herald over the last 5 to 10 years, making the case for optimism. And everything that Nicholas said is broadly right. I think we are a richer, more prosperous, more secure country than we were 30, 50 years ago. The evidence is overwhelming. However, I'm just more pessimistic for the 4 reasons I mentioned. I think one of the key differences between 2022 and, say, the 1980s and the 1990s is the quality of our political leadership in Canberra. I think if you go back to the 1980s, when our nation was very insular, we were bogged down by protectionism, industrial unrest, and it took a Labor government of Prime Minister Bob Hawke and his Treasurer Paul Keating, backed strongly by the coalition led by John Howard and Andrew Peacock and John Hewson. And there was a consensus that what was needed was sound, productivity-enhancing public policies, the kind of policies that Financial Review editorial page, the Australian think tanks like CIS had long been promoting. That is, opening up our country to global competition, reducing tariffs, putting in place all sorts of reforms, embracing competition policy, privatisation, and that allowed Australia to weather external shocks. We weathered the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s, the US tech wreck in the early 2000s, and of course the global financial crisis in 07, 08, 09. I just don't see any commitment on either side of politics, coalition or Labor, to support the kind of productivity-enhancing reforms that will help us weather the next external shock. Okay. And that's where I think fundamentally I'm profoundly pessimistic.
My question to you, Nicholas, is you've given us a very rosy picture up to now, but I'm sure that on many of your Macquarie Bank advertisements, it would say past performance is not indicative of future return.
Quite right.
Why is it different on this occasion?
I think it's a good question. Obviously, the past is the weakest guide possible for the future, but it is something. I think what we can take from the past is the process that we talked about, this process of contest that goes on and competition, that actually works. And as long as we can maintain that process, then good outcomes will happen. Now, we have in business, we're always involved in competition and contests of all different sorts. In politics today, we've got massive contests going on between at all different level, and indeed internationally, we have a contest taking place in terms of where China is at and versus the United States. Now, this is part of life. Nothing is clear, but we do know that the process where these ideas are contested, where outcomes are contested, that's the way we find the way forward. There is no obvious way forward. We're dealing with uncertainty. We're in the fog of what will the future be. We've got to try different things. And that's what we're looking at the moment. And a lot of the political debate, I think, is about people asking questions, trying different things, and actually trying to move forward.
Let's take some questions from the floor. Over there.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your comments just earlier. So I'm interested in this idea of a contest producing economic welfare, consumer welfare, pushing up the production frontier. But through history, we've also seen contest actually producing war.
Yes,
types of war. And this certainly is something that in the US, where I'm currently based, is of deep concern in the Indo-Pacific. So I wonder how you square that away with the economic growth that you talk, but periods in which war can actually depress growth.
Yeah, I think that's probably the key question. You know, this is where contest obviously goes very badly wrong between nations. And as Tom mentioned, fortunately, we haven't had a world conflict for some time. I think you can take a number of views. The answer is, of course, coming back to Rob's comment, we don't know. Steven Pinker's argument, though, in terms of the decline of warfare as an acceptable way to solve problems, seems to be flooding across the world and has flooded across the world. It doesn't mean there will be no war, but certainly far less likely than it was before. And again, coming back to the questions of the good old days and where Tom and I slightly differ, I remember the 60s as, I think, quite differently. I remember the Vietnam War, 60,000 Americans and countless Vietnamese died, that we were on the edge of extinction as a planet. That it was considered reasonable for the American president to threaten to blow up the planet on the basis of missiles going into Cuba. So that's why I'm slightly different from Tom in terms of how good the good old days were. I see the good old days as being as challenged as any. And I don't see where we are today as any worse than where we've been. Not to say it's safe, and I guess coming back to Rob's point, we are not living in a utopia. Don't get me wrong here. We are living far from a utopia. There are things wrong in every aspect of our business lives, of our government lives, of international lives. There are bad things going badly wrong. I don't disagree with that, but I'm just trying to put it in the context of a world where we have actually seen moral and political and material progress historically, and just saying, well, is it all that much worse now? That's my argument. Not to say it's perfect.
Well, I think the last 30 years we've seen an overwhelming consensus that globalisation and economic interdependency would mean perpetual peace, and that China, the more it became open to the world and integrated with the world and embraced the rules-based international order, its rise would be benign and it would become more liberal at home. Well, as we've seen, particularly in the last 10 years, China has become more assertive abroad and more nationalist and authoritarian at home. So much for the end of history. Now, I look at the world through a realist prism, and we at CIS have been very fortunate. 3 years ago, we invited the distinguished political scientist, Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, to speak in front of many sold-out events. Some of them are about 500,000 views on YouTube. He's an outstanding public speaker, and his point is that what we've seen now is a return of great power politics, and that China is rising the way that other great powers in history have. And as it rises, as its power grows economically, its definition of its national interests will grow with it. And as a result, China will start to assert a sphere of influence in areas on which its future prosperity and security depend. All great powers have done this, including the United States in the 19th century when they kicked the Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. The problem, though, is that the United States is the reigning hegemon, thank goodness, in East Asia, and Washington, one of the only bipartisan issues in Washington among Democrats and Republicans, is a belief that America will go to great lengths to hedge against China. And we're seeing that right now in the United States policies across East Asia. So I think that what we're seeing here is the return of great power competition, something we never thought we'd see in our own neighbourhood, but it's going to define international relations in our neighbourhood for the foreseeable future. And history, frankly, has not prepared us for this moment.
Yes, sir.
I really enjoyed both presentations, and I was thinking, Nicholas, when you got to your last point about China and the demographic threat to them, hearing something that rang true for me. I heard something very similar said by the head of the Beijing Demography Institute a few years ago in Hong Kong. But in a way, it strikes me that what you're both talking about is a timing issue. The best is yet to come, but when?
Tomorrow.
Right now is the problem with China, not when they have the demography problem in another generation or half a generation. And the same thing might be said about the cancel problem and the climate problem and renewables and so on. So what Tom is focused on is kind of the next few years. And what Nicholas was talking about is eventually the best will come.
Sure.
Would you agree that it's a timing issue?
No, I wouldn't be that pessimistic personally. I mean, I don't think it's obviously no one knows about COVID. COVID's the big unknown still in terms of what could happen there. But that graph I put up before of showing 3.5% GDP growth year in, year out, regardless of all the things that happened, going all the way back to that went back to 1980. But if you go back to 1945, it's a similar story. It's a pretty powerful engine, the global economy. And so, no, I don't think we have to wait for X number of years. And just in terms of the China issue with demographics, I mean, that's just I was just trying to put myself in the leadership's position in terms of what they would be worried by. I don't think it's necessarily a good or bad, but it just means that things are way more complex than the idea that China's going to become the global hegemon and run the world. It's going to be way more complex than that.
I mean, the Mearsheimer thesis is premised on China continuing to grow as it has over the last 30 to 40 years. But no one knows. I mean, of course, as Nicholas points out, China has very real weaknesses and limitations, not just demographic, but environmental, ethnic divisions. So
As does every nation.
Every nation. So if China does indeed collapse, as some scholars like Professor David Shambar from George Washington say, that could also create all sorts of problems.
Terrible.
Well, I've got a number of people. There was a gentleman. Oh, you've jumped your queue.
I've jumped in.
Yes, you have.
Let me take
This is a colleague of ours, Glenn Fay, who runs our education program.
Yes, so
Glenn,
be careful, Glenn.
And so, look, no, my question is to that particular area. Nicholas, you pointed out the phenomenal growth that we saw in 250 years since the Industrial Revolution. What accompanied that was also a cumulative increase in educational attainment. And to rattle another past CIS guest, Eric Hanyashek has pointed out that education precedes economic growth in the long run. But today we've seen a flatlining in educational outcomes in Australia and across the developed world. Is the best still to come if our education results do not have that, don't continue to see the rise that we've seen for basically 100 years or 200 years?
Well, I think I can say that the good news is the CIS, with others, is very much leading the fight in terms of educational reform and actually saying we're spending $20 billion a year extra, as you were saying before, on education here in Australia. What's the outcome? And I think that's the question we should be asking, this idea of contesting the status quo, of actually asking the question. That's the most important thing. So I think it's as citizens, as the role that we play in this country. But more broadly, if you look at things like we've talked about before, the Success Academy and the charter schools in the United States, radically better outcomes as a result of people trying one thing, coming back to underlying thesis, trying one thing, child-centred education, all that stuff. Okay, well, that hasn't worked. Let's go see what else does work. And I think that's the great thing in terms about how we in our societies are able to learn from the policies.
We're coming towards the end, so I'm going to ask for both comments and questions, to be brief. The gentleman there that...
You got Max?
Mightn't surprise you to know that I lean towards the Nicholas Moore side of the argument.
You're a former colleague of Nicholas's.
I am somewhat biased. But it just seems to me that, to some extent, what we've seen from all of the graphs is that we need to look at the big picture, the wave. Where is the world? How has the world developed and gone? And to some extent, it seemed to me a lot of the argumentation which is negative is looking backwards or just at the present. We have to look at the global hegemon of the United States. Whether we like the United States or not, there was another force rising. Is that inevitable? Is it immutable? Probably it is. The question is, how do you manage the transition? How do you manage the change? Now, I don't believe the United States is going to fall to pieces tomorrow. But to some extent, neither do I believe that China is going to take over the world tomorrow. But is there a wave? And it's a question of how we manage the change. And it's no good our politicians, and given that I've always been to some extent seen as on the right of politics, it's no good just simply saying, this is what we thought in the last government or the government 20 years ago. It's such a minuscule period. We have to look at where is the world heading? How do we fit into that process? How do we manage our transition? That, I think, is the real question. And I don't think there's a lot of discussion about that, which I think is a pity.
Max, can I just respond briefly? Max, you can have great waves of progress, but still have periods of instability and chaos and wars. I mean, in 1910, Norman Angell published a famous book called The Great Illusion. And his argument was that Europe had never been more economically interdependent, and this meant perpetual peace on the continent. And yet 4 years later, you had the Great War.
The last one, the gentleman I've been trying to get to for a while there, sir.
Well, it certainly isn't saving the best for last, but it's been fascinating listening to Cassandra and Dr. Pangloss. But, somewhere in between the truth probably lies.
Although, sir, as I pointed out, Cassandra was always right.
That's what could be true. Could be true. I don't know. But and then Tom, I appreciate his depression. Anybody who has a constant diet of mearsheimer, who can write a whole treatise on international politics and not have the word economics appear in the index, he's got my sympathy. But just coming closer to home, I guess one thing that struck me recently is the extraordinary cohesion that Australia has in fact shown through the pandemic. It's really quite remarkable. We've got some fraying at the edges. We've got little political circuses in various states, etc. And people now are distinctly grumpy. But if you compare it to most other countries, there's been, given our extraordinarily diverse backgrounds in terms of ethnicity and religion, etc., it's been astonishing to me that we've shown the level of cohesion that we've done. And I take that as being a very good signal for the future of this country.
We'll leave it there. I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the discussion, but not the end of the debate. As you can tell, I'm going to ask Anjani Nadarajani.
Anjali's been a former policy analyst here at CIS. We wanted to keep her, but Minter Ellison, the legal firm, stole it from us. Ladies and gentlemen, Anjali Nadaranjan.
Just to summarise and give a vote of thanks.
ladies and gentlemen, John Stuart Mill, a 19th century philosopher and longtime hero of the CIS, once said, "He who knows only his own side knows little of that." And it means that we must subject our views to scrutiny and debate if we want to understand the strengths and shortcomings of our case. And tonight, I think we can agree that Tom and Nicholas, through the moderation of Robert, have done a remarkable job in exploring the future of Australia and given us much to contemplate. I must confess that throughout the pandemic, I did and do still share some of Tom's sentiments. The pandemic amplified a sense of hopelessness and apathy among my generation. They say our 20s are the best years of our lives, but here we were, trammeled by relentless lockdowns, disrupted educations, and delayed career starts. As I aptly stated in the CIS Magic Money Tree video, politicians scattered cash like confetti at a wedding, leaving a mountain of debt. All whilst Western liberal democracies embraced increasingly illiberal policies. With greater intervention came greater responsibility and an expectation and even dependency on government to solve our problems. Now, the nice part about being a pessimist is you're never disappointed. You're constantly being proven right, but also at times pleasantly surprised. And I say this because tonight's conversation has shown that as much as pessimism is about seeing the difficulty in opportunity, optimism is about seeing the opportunity in every difficulty. Despite the doom and gloom that Tom has heralded, the dark times ahead can allow us to adapt, to innovate, and compel governments and businesses to utilise their strengths to prepare for the future. Tonight, Australia's economic future was discussed, and it remains to be seen how Australia will map its way out of our fiscal problems. This, coupled with net zero climate policies, are driving soaring energy prices and stifling growth, which makes for a very grim picture. However, the debate has also made me cautiously optimistic because, after all, it has taken open economies and freedom to explore new ideas and technologies. The pandemic can give government a forward-looking economic agenda that promotes entrepreneurship, innovation, new tech, and appropriate risk-taking. Examples may be a more competitive tax system and ramping up investment into research and developing cheaper, low CO2 energy, which could drive affordable greener energy. On cancel culture in China, I'm also inclined to be a bit more optimistic. It's true that cancel culture has sunk its claws into liberal democracies across the West. I was at university at a time when campuses, once bastions for free and open inquiry, became breeding grounds for identity politics and attacks on free speech. But a glass half full approach is to recognise that it gives classical liberals the opportunity to develop courage culture and take a principled stand in defending civil discourse and free speech, practising tolerance and humility in the battle of ideas. And like many movements, cancel culture has increasingly veered to such extremities that it's now alienating many on all sides of the political spectrum. And yes, while China's wolf warrior diplomacy threatens regional stability, Australia has shown a tough resilience to China's aggression, something which China has underestimated. It's also promising that Australia has realised the need to diversify its export market and is strengthening alliances through AUKUS and the Quad, which will offer security and public goods to the region and to deter China on issues like coercion towards Taiwan. It was the West and Enlightenment that brought about pragmatic problem solving, and it's important that Australians do not lose confidence in these core values. There will always be problems and challenges, but we must recognise that the progressive direction of human history, which has lifted the human condition to heights never seen before, is set to continue. Today, we have better tools at our disposal than ever before to find new and better ways of doing things. Now, tonight has shown us more than ever that despite the dark times, individual liberty, open inquiry, and market-oriented reform are important. As a former CIS staffer myself, I can attest to the brilliant work, talent, and events the CIS produces to champion these ideas, all of which is only made possible through the generous support of donors and members like yourself. So I urge you to continue to donate to and support the CIS in achieving its mission. And with that, could you all please join me for a round of applause in thanking Tom, Nicholas, and Robert for the incredible insights tonight.
That's great. Well done, Andrew. That was really good. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.